So here's a problem that I have seen over the last 30 years. Law enforcement simply react, even though there are elements within law enforcement that call it proactive enforcement. But when it comes to some sort of terrorist attack or some kind of mass shooting,
Hmm.
they're constantly just preparing for how would they respond to it next time. For
Yeah.
example, when there's a shooting, say at a school, right? There's a mass shooting, and law enforcement all of a sudden reacts to it, and then they say, "Hey, wait, what did we do wrong? How did we not respond correctly? We had that
Yeah.
with Uvalde." Does that make sense?
Yeah. I got you.
So this has become the culture of law enforcement is they wait till something happens, and not of the fault of their own. This is just the way the culture has become, and they wait for something to happen before they learn from that and say, how do we respond to it? We saw that with the January 1st attacks when that guy who is a sympathizer
Yeah.
decided to, New Orleans. Immediately after the attack, once the triage was out of the way, once they had, seen, you see the next day in the media, they're talking about how come the pylons weren't there? How come
Yeah.
the sidewalks weren't covered up? And then now they're going to spend money on, okay, next, we need to make sure we barricade this correctly because, well, this guy drove through the sidewalk and that's why he was able to, people, rather than thinking, okay, if we close the sidewalks, if someone is that determined to attack people, the sidewalks are closed, they're going to take another route. They're going to
Hmm.
come in on a bicycle. They're going to come in, of a building,
Yeah.
many different avenues that a person can adjust if they have their mind set. The reality is, how do you identify those people? Somebody who's, in mass shooting like Uvalde, there were signs there
Yeah.
that people could have been trained to recognize, not just law enforcement, but the public. And even with this guy who did that January 1st, there were signs there as well. And somebody could have alerted the authorities. My question is, if somebody would have stopped this guy as he was driving from Houston to New Orleans, when I'm talking about somebody, I'm talking about law enforcement, right? Let's say they
Yeah.
would have stopped him on a traffic stop for speeding, right?
Hmm.
Would they even know how to determine if he's off to doing something like he did? And the reality is they're not. And I'll give you an example with this whole reactive response
Okay.
and trying to, prepare for time when there's an attack.
Yeah.
I remember after 11, when Department of Homeland Security was created, the government released a lot of funding for training first responders in detecting terrorism. And the way it works with the law enforcement training is when there is a certain amount of funds that are released, that are authorized, and they're given to states or agencies, they are supposed to put that towards training. So you'll have a lot of training companies or people who are not qualified will literally create courses, not from personal experience or operational experience, but from information they get off the internet. And then what they do is they use buzzwords like terrorism, because when they use those buzzwords, now it qualifies for that specific fund that was released to be used for that training.
Oh, okay.
Prime example of it is around mid 2002, maybe it was 2003, I can't remember, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I got you.
I went to a training class and it was a criminal patrol class. For the people who don't understand when they watch this, it's more interdiction. It's usually catching people who are smuggling drugs, smuggling
Yeah.
stolen articles,
Okay.
people who are in transit, they're doing, cross country. And there was this specific class. The person that taught this class was in no position to be talking about terrorism, right? There was a free class, about 100, 145 people in the classroom. So, and it was so usually when there's a free class for law enforcement, a lot of agencies will just send officers to it because it's not costing them anything.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I'm sitting in this class and they're going over traffic stops, talking about, how to, catch criminals, warrants, talk about behaviors. And the second day, this instructor actually tells guys, if you stop someone who's darker skin and they look like they're Middle Eastern, and you're talking to them, and in the process of talking to them, they start mumbling things under their breath, like very quietly, and you hear the word Allahu Akbar, shoot him in the head.
Wow.
Right. So I'm like, oh shit.
Jeez.
And as he's going forward, he keeps saying, because usually before something that's, committed, right? Before they commit an atrocity, usually what they'll do is they'll say Allahu Akbar before they blow themselves up. So immediately, I'm sitting in class and I
Yeah.
raise my hand and I go, can you say that again? He goes, what part? And I said, what is he supposed to say? He says, Allah Akbar. And I said, what does that mean? I don't know. But you can see videos on YouTube. You could see terrorists overseas right before they blow something up or they blow themselves up. They say Allah Akbar.
Wow.
And I know what he's referencing because there's a lot of movies out.
Well,
Same
sure.
thing,
Sure.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
you've seen movies where hijackers are taking over the Allah
Yeah.
Akbar,
It's a
stuff
very
like that.
typical. It's very thing.
Exactly. So I go, what is the Allah Akbar mean? And he blew, so well, God is great. And I say, okay, so what you're teaching is the equivalent is stopping someone. Let's say an officer is working in a town, and on a Sunday afternoon at 12:30, 12:45, the officer decides, hey, I'm going to go run some traffic, right? He's in a neighborhood about 12:30, 12:45 on a Sunday, right? What do you think people are doing on a Sunday?
Going to church.
Or coming from church at
Yeah.
12:30, 12:45. And let's say this little old lady runs a stop sign. She's not paying attention. She's trying to hurry up and get home. She runs the stop sign. And the officer walks up to the car, and the officer says, ma'am, I stopped you for running a stop sign. Oh, but you know what? Just going to give you a warning. Please pay attention. And she goes, hallelujah. Does that mean the officer should shoot her in the head too?
Well, no.
Right. Because even though Allah Akbar and hallelujah, they don't translate exactly the same, but they're both phrases praising God. At that point, the guy has no answers. So he finishing up that segment during the break time. I go back and I'm like, look, dude, what are you doing, man? And he's like, well, why do you ask that question? And I said, listen, there's a lot of Arabic speakers that are going to say Allah. It could be just that scenario that I told you, that a person was told, hey, I'm getting a warning or whatever. I said, you're over here telling 140 cops, some of them former military guys who have gone through watching their buddies get, blown up, bombs and stuff like that, or they've had family members that have been, killed, and them to now have to take that trauma and apply it to on this, to someone on the side of the road, when in reality it could be just a Middle Eastern guy who's happy he's not getting a ticket. And I said, what kind of you have in terrorism? He said, well, I don't, but we look for our common denominators, so to say, that's seen that kind of paves the way for us to look for indicators of terrorism.
Wow. No background is crazy.
Right. And then I think it was a year later after they had created TSA, there's a lot of training that started coming out telling people that in order for you to determine if somebody's a terrorist or not, look at how they're dressed, right? Talking about the abaya, talking about the kufi that people put on their head, and then you watch for the beard and things like that.
Yeah.
And I watched this happen over the next several years where the Middle Eastern community, the Muslim community, were just being targeted. Now, we have to be fair here. These poor officers, they don't know their culture.
Yeah.
They don't know what's religion. And they're being fed this information, which is now generating suspicion towards anyone from the Middle East, correct?
Yeah.
And that effect is carried to this day. That's why you have the Middle Eastern community that are very, very apprehensive about getting involved in law enforcement because, you got to think, you were 20 years old. There were kids back then, okay? 20, 25 years old, they were kids. And they have their parents being talked to a certain way. And then now that's passed on to them. So they have pretty much got this indication that because they're Middle Eastern, they're constantly going to be targeted.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it creates the reality is law enforcement needs the Middle Eastern community, especially the Muslim community, because Muslim community are the ones that are going to be able to find out who within the community could be problematic. Because I can tell you right now, Muslims don't want these terrorists because it's making everybody look bad. They're having to pay the price for it. Okay. So rather than just the conclusion as law enforcement and say, oh, we got to have a solution for this. And the solution is let's figure out how to respond to it. And then instead of getting proper training, right, they're just putting things together and throwing it out there. And I've watched this happen over the last, 2 decades, right? Really blame the officers because they're growing up in parts of the country where they may never even come in contact with a Middle Eastern person, right? I spent most of my nearly 3 decades career in the South until here recently in the last 10 years when you had a lot of Middle Easterners come down and start purchasing all these gas stations and stuff like that. You don't have a large Middle Eastern community in rural areas, right? And some of the places I lived, the county might have 14,000 people and the city was 2,200 people. It's not like they have a concentration like Arabs and Muslims or from the Middle East that are
Right.
living there to have grown up around people that they know. The only exposure these guys are getting to, as far as Middle East comes, is atrocities that's in the news, right?
Yeah.
Now, this doesn't apply to places like Patterson, New Jersey, or New York City, or LA, or some of the big metropolitan areas like Detroit. You have a lot of people there. Those cops, if they're from that area, they grew up being around other Middle Easterners, so they have a different level of exposure, right? Because they
Right.
went to school with those kids, right? Their
Mm-hmm.
parents may be friends with those people. They frequent stores that are owned by them. They've built
Yeah.
that relationship. However, in certain parts of the country, in the South, in the Midwest, and some of the rural Midwest, unless someone knows someone of Middle East, especially someone who gets into law enforcement, the only exposure they have is the negative that they see in the media, and then they go to law enforcement training, and then it's reinforced that
Yeah.
everyone wants to blow themselves up. That one thing that I hear when somebody says Allah Akbar, shoot him in the head. Man, here's the poor guy who happens to be a very religious person, okay, ends up getting killed.
Yeah.
The biggest problem is that not only that officer, not because of his own fault, is because he's just going by what he was trained to do, right? Not only he gets in trouble, his entire department, his superiors, the chief of police, the sheriff, the state police, director,
Yeah.
they all become civilly liable because for the actions of the officer.
Mm-hmm.
So my solution to it is, hey, first of all, make sure you get proper training when it comes to something like this, because this is not the same as any other law enforcement training, because you have to take into consideration culture, you have to take into consideration religion, and a lot of people don't realize, and I'll tell you, I'll be frank with you, a lot of Muslims themselves don't realize that there are different denominations. What everyone knows is there's this Shia and Sunni.
Mm-hmm.
They don't realize that there's actually more. There's Ibadis, and then it branches off. You can get under Shia, and then under Shia, there's different schools of thought. There's different interpretations. Under Sunni, there's different schools of thought. There's different interpretations. Then you
Yeah.
have the Quranists, the people who don't even believe in the Hadith. This is very, very complex
Very
type
in
of.
depth.
It is. It is. It's a very, very with because you have 2 point something billion Muslims. Okay, they're the ones that are going to be able to know, hey, this guy is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He doesn't believe what we believe.
Yeah.
They need to be able to be comfortable enough to come to law enforcement, go to the station, call the FBI and say, hey, we got this guy that's hanging around our community. He's saying some crazy ass shit. We don't want to get involved in it, but please, somebody look into this dude
Yeah.
because we don't agree with what he says, but culturally we say anything because it's embarrassing, because that's where the culture comes in. A lot of Middle Eastern people, and I say Middle Eastern because a lot of times people are focused on Arabs. That's just one ethnicity. You got Middle Eastern people who are Persian, who are Kurds, who are Turks, who are
Yeah.
Assyrian, who are, Phoenician. You've got Amazigh up in northern.
A bunch.
It is, and you get into the Indian subcontinent. The people got
Yeah.
Punjabi. You got so many different. You got Tajiks. You
Yeah.
got there's just so many different cultures, and it's referred to collectively as Middle Eastern because they share the same culture. And one of the
Right.
biggest things is within that culture is there is a hesitation to confront people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it has drastic effects on their lifestyle and how they deal with the rest of the community. But I can tell you that a majority, especially the ones living in the West,
Mm-hmm.
of course, there's a lot in the Middle East as well. You just don't hear them in the news, but a lot of them who live in the West are more than willing to come forth and say, hey, this little Yahoo over here is retarded.
Yeah.
Okay. We can't do anything about it. We've tried to talk to, because that's the first thing they do is, hey, they try to show them the right way. Hey, man, you're wrong. But there's only so much they can do. They can't force them to change their beliefs, right? Especially if somebody's politically motivated or they're subscribing to a very misinformed version of the religion,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's only so much the community can do as far as trying to change the path of their thought process.
Sure.
There's going to come to a point where say, hey, we're not going to have anything to do with this dude. But you know what? He's going to do something stupid. We need to tell law enforcement about it because we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
At that point, as it stands today, most Middle East like, fuck it, we're not getting involved in this shit.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid that they're going to go to somebody and say something. Next thing you know, they're getting targeted.
Yeah.
Because now it's become that they are literally trying to mess with Middle Easterners. When something happens, October 7th, when ISIS goes off, when 9/11 happens, the focus turns on an entire population and an entire population that practices a certain religion. If you look back at what happened in 9/11, after 9/11, you had the Sikh community, okay? The Punjabis, the Sikhs, they're Indian, they're not even Muslim.
Yeah.
They were getting targeted by people, okay? Being called all kinds of names, terrorists, simply because they wear a turban, okay?
Yeah.
There has been instances where some of them were mistreated by law enforcement, you know, and I'm not going to get into the details of trying to cut any department, but as from a law enforcement perspective, the first thing I look at, and someone who trains law enforcement, is, well, this guy got mistreated because he's a Sikh, because the guy who mistreated him did not know the difference between who is a Sikh and who is a Muslim and who's an Imam and who's a Shia and who's a Sunni. He just simply reacted to the turban. That comes from certain trainings that try to put a physical characteristic on an ideology that's problematic. So the best way to handle that is, number one, you have to mend the relationship with the Middle Eastern community, because that's going to be your first source.
Yeah.
Number two, you've got to train the officers by people who are well qualified. Okay. And when I say well qualified, I don't mean bring an intelligence guy.
Yeah.
Nothing against the military intelligence people, but here's the problem. The intelligence people only have intelligence and the way people behave in a conflict zone, right?
Yeah.
I would actually say that an intelligence person who works for an agency like the NSA or the CIA would be better qualified than a military person, because
Really?
there is because there's a difference between collection of assets versus correct collection of intelligence based on wartime and in a conflict zone, because the dynamics change.
Well, yeah,
right?
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Right. So if you're got some insurgent group in Iraq, and they just 12 of those fighters, that military intelligence obviously going to be over there interrogating. So the beliefs that they're extracting out of these people and the motivation is not the same as someone who is, let's say, from someone who follows ISIS ideology. Kind of cover, just to give a little bit of there are terrorists who are politically motivated, and there are terrorists who are ideologically motivated. Okay. A couple of examples. Hamas, okay? Political motivation. Yes, they do have some ideological issues, okay, because of the way they interpret the religion, but it's mainly because it involves a conflict between the Israeli Arab, Israeli Palestinian conflict, correct?
Correct.
Now motivated. When you work there to ISIS, and now ISIS-K and ISIS that operates in Maghreb, which is the northern African area, okay, the top part where it's majority.
Yeah.
They're maybe political because they're trying to control a region, right? And instill their theological law, okay? And, it's commonly referred to as Sharia law. And that's a whole different topic there, because there's some dynamics in that needs to be addressed as well. But those folks, their is to establish a worldwide government under Islamic law. It has nothing to do with, whether they took our land or, they're trying to get like statehood or something like that. More ideological, and it's based on interpretation. Exactly. It's way different because they're going by interpretation of, some of them even to the end of times, of what's going to happen in the end of times, right? Yeah. So in every religion, you have those who want to expedite the end of times because they want the world to end.
Yeah.
And there are people who call themselves Muslims. The rest of the Muslims don't consider them Muslims. Okay. They're not going to come out and say it, because in Islam, you're not supposed to call someone who calls themselves a Muslim not a Muslim. Okay. Because judgment is left to God. But in reality, they know it. These people don't represent our religion.
Yeah.
Okay. But those people, some of them believe that in the end of time to be triggered, the entire world has to be under Islamic control. Okay. You know what I'm saying? It's literally how they interpret. Okay. And that's a whole different ball game, because as I was talking about earlier, then there are so many different denominations. Within those denominations, there are explanations they're going by based on certain books that are kind of skewed, okay, or
Yeah.
they're interpreted the wrong way, depending on who's interpreting it for them. And you know, to cover all of
Mhm.
this to say to law enforcement in the United States and even the civilian population, um, I've actually spent a lot of time researching. Plus, I'm from the military, so this is something that is dear to me,
Yeah.
right? Because it does involve my people. And
Well,
when I
sure.
say my
Yeah.
people, I'm talking collectively, all of the Middle East,
Yeah.
okay? And I've actually developed a course for a patrol guy, for an investigator, for people to be able to understand the so many moving parts when it comes to theology and how things are interpreted. You
Hmm.
know, just to give you some insight, right? You have the Quran,
Yeah.
and then you have what you call the tafsir, which is the explanation or the exegesis, and then you have hadiths,
Hmm.
right? Hadiths, there are hundreds of thousands of hadiths, and these are sayings attributed to the prophet as to how to handle certain situations, right?
Okay.
Now, these hadiths were collected over several hundred years, and depending on the denomination people follow, they may subscribe to certain hadith while they reject certain hadith, okay? And
Okay.
that's a whole section that I cover in the class that I teach, as far as like where the variations, kind of the
Yeah.
tafsir, which is the exegesis based on which denomination they follow, uses hadith to try to explain what happens in the Quran. Okay,
Okay.
the Quran itself is written in storyline chapters. So each basically a story about a certain time, about a event that was going on, and what morals what moral lesson are you supposed to learn in that chapter. Now,
Okay.
you're supposed to learn is going to be dictated by the exegesis of how it's explained, and furthermore enhanced by the hadith. So you could see where, depending on the denomination and which
Yeah.
hadith they're going to use to have the explanation,
It can
their
change.
interpretation could change.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then also the linguistics that goes with it, because modern is nothing like classical. They call it Hijazi Arabic. Right? The Hijazi Arabic is more like where you have to read between the lines, okay, and also understand the culture, because certain things mean certain things, certain words, certain things
Yeah.
in different
Context.
subcultures, right? And really take what the Quran says as literal lesson plan
I
and how
got you.
things are. These are things that not only the general public should understand, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Law enforcement needs to know, because you could have somebody who's just a traditional Muslim who literally dresses the same way, who's a radical fundamentalist. You know, you got traditional fundamentalists and then a radical and then a terrorist, because they just share the same culture, not necessarily the same theological understanding, but the same
Mm.
culture.
Okay.
So you could see where if law enforcement is not trained correctly, they could take the physical characteristics of one who's just a traditionalist, right?
Yeah.
Like a conservative person, and then automatically assume that he's a terrorist
Treat them
because he
different wrong.
treat him wrong because he's dressed it that way.
Exactly.
And that's what becomes enforcement, because of the reactive nature of preparation. They grasp for information they don't know anything about. So they apply what I consider like a mathematical solution to a behavioral, moral, and theological problem. All right.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then come out with these checklists of, if a person's having a cone beard, if a person
Yeah.
has a mark on their forehead, if a person's wearing a white kufi, if a person's wearing a white
A
abaya,
lot of
or if they have a
stereotypes.
sandal. Exactly. All those stereotypes. And then the poor guy who happens to be an older guy who's very, very traditional, and he's a very, very religious
Not even
person.
related.
Right. Walks into some poor officer somewhere who knows shit about the culture. He hasn't been properly trained. The
Mm-hmm.
training has never been available, or he heard someone say this is what terrorists like. He goes and confronts the guy, starts
Mm-hmm.
drilling him a bunch of questions. The Middle Eastern guy is already under the impression that the cops hate him.
Mm-hmm.
He starts, you know, becoming very, very apprehensive to engage. The officer now takes that apprehensiveness as, and then it ends up escalating the problem. And next thing you know, shit hits the hand, you know, shit hits the fan, and then somebody's in jail. And then
Yep.
next thing you know, now the department's getting sued.
Mm-hmm.
All of these could be avoided by proper law enforcement. Now, when it comes to citizens, when I say it's important for citizens, it's not like the citizens are going to go around and interrogate everybody,
Well, sure. Yeah.
right? But do citizens have kids
Well,
who are
sure.
playing video games, that are chatting people on Instagram, they're chatting with people on Snapchat, they're
Also
chatting on
watching these
people,
movies.
watching these movies? But then that kid starts making a friend with some
Mm-hmm.
guy from overseas. right? Let's say
Yeah.
this kid comes from a household that's broken,
Yep.
right? You know, mom's a drug addict, so that's how the kid copes his games. Starts making friends with this guy, right? And the guy, and he starts kind of opening up to the guy that he's home.
Yeah.
And then, the guy's like, hey, come over here. We're going to take care of you. You become a Muslim and you can be part of the brotherhood.
Bring
God's
him
going
in
to
there.
bring him under his own. But in reality, he's being groomed and recruited because the person who's doing this,
It's like indoctrination.
he's indoctrinating him, setting him up to get him overseas or even here by sending him documents to radicalize the person and then turn around and say, well, the reason why your mom's on drugs because the politicians over there keep the borders open, and because of that, your mom is on drugs. So it's all America's fault.
Completely misleading them.
Completely misleading him. Now the anger starts coming out of this kid. He grabs his daddy's gun out of the closet, right? And he goes, ooh, and he just starts
Blasting everybody.
Exactly.
For nothing.
For nothing. Now, the question is, during that he's being indoctrinated, he have told one of his friends, could he have, let's say he didn't come from a broken home. Let's say the kid just was bullied in school. So he just kind of retreated to his gaming. That was his way of coping with it. And somewhere along the line, he tells his mom, hey, mom, I want to be a Muslim, right? Because he's being recruited online.
Sure.
Okay. I'm not saying that there's a problem with a kid wanting to, explore religions. What I'm saying is, who is it that's recruiting him and do that? And number two, does the parent have a way to determine, is he just making friends who are Muslims, or is it some radical guy that's going to exploit his state of mind to push him over the edge to do something? So the reason why I created these series of courses is to enable both the normal civilian population and especially law enforcement, since that's where I spent nearly 30 years and I saw it firsthand.
Yeah.
To enable both to be able to go, hey, we're trying to pick out the needle in the haystack, right? The oddball. But if I don't know what the norm is, how do I know which one is the oddball?
Exactly.
You see? So that's the goal, is to provide the education, right? And I'll be honest with you. I've spoke to other officers who are, as I break down, especially when it comes to denominations, and they're flabbergasted. They're like, "Holy shit! I didn't even think about that." You're right, because the one thing with Middle Eastern culture is it is very tribal. If you're born into a certain geographical area, into a certain ethnicity, into a certain tribe, and the whole tribe practices one specific denomination of Islam, to you as the person who's practicing that from that tribe, that is the Islam.
Yeah. That's all you
And
know.
unless you leave that area and go to another country, you may not even know that there are other denominations, right? You can't really apply that in the United States because it's kind of like a melting pot of a lot of different cultures, a lot of different, right? But in the Middle East, you're never going to see somebody that lives in a village outside of Raqqa to go to, let's say, Abu Dhabi or Amman, Jordan, and experience that, hey, wait a minute, these Muslims over here, they don't practice like I do, or their definition and their exegesis is their, all this tafsir doesn't seem normal, right? Because they don't leave those villages. They don't experience to the outside world. They're only told.
That's all they know.
That's all they know. That's right. They're only told this is what it is. From the local, sheikhs, sheikhs are, I wouldn't say scholars, imams or preacher. If you compare it to U.S., it's like when I've had these conversations with these cops that are from, Middle Eastern backgrounds and from different denominations, they're like, oh shit, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out, right? As a white American cop who grew, let's say I'm a white American cop who grew Christian and don't know shit of the religion.
Yeah.
How am I supposed to determine if a dude that I've stopped who's got a beard and he says he's a Muslim, how am I supposed to know the difference between what he practices and what ISIS practices, and what the Taliban practices, right?
It'd be hard to tell.
It'd be hard to tell because I have no reference point to compare it. Thing I can go by is what a training tells me, which is what the outside look of this person is.
For sure. And if false training, it could ruin the thing. It could.
Right. And the bad training, it's going to put this guy on alarm. He's going to think that this guy is a threat. And then he's going to take him to jail for something, whatever, right? Or treat him a certain way, which turns around and puts the department at a liability, because when the civil lawsuit is filed for, racial profiling or whatever the case is, or false arrest, because there's a magnitude that could go wrong, right? Now the department's liable.
Yep. And
right?
it could have all been prevented if proper training.
It could have all been prevented by simply having proper training. Now, the reality is, how much of that training out there is
Actually proper.
actually proper and comprehensive enough? I can tell you right now, I nearly spent 30 years. As law enforcement goes, not much.
Really?
Not much.
Wow.
When it goes to military, like special operations and intelligence people, I'm
Sure.
talking about intelligence people. I'm not talking about somebody sitting in an office at like Dallas Police Department.
Yeah, behind
I'm
the desk
talking
all day.
about, right. I'm talking about like Homeland Security,
Mhm.
NSA, CIA, different type of, because they do travel across the world.
They
So
see
they're able,
everything.
they see it and they can experience it. And some of their colleagues are from those backgrounds. So they're able to get a baseline of what normality is,
For
right?
sure.
And unbeknownst to a lot of people in the United States, you have thousands of Middle Easterners and Muslims that serve in the U.S. military. You have hundreds, I shouldn't say thousands, that are in special operations forces. Okay, and people don't know that. If somebody wants to look at, and I can't remember what the guy's, there was
Yeah.
a SEAL, there was a Navy SEAL that actually got killed in a training exercise accident in North Mississippi, close to Memphis, when they were doing a training exercise. He was a Muslim. He was
Really?
in the SEAL teams, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So because they don't advertise that, right? Now you go into the NSA, sure, it's under military. There's a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims who work for these like DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency,
Yeah.
because they do the linguistics, they have to have the language and be able
Yeah.
to, listen. And then you go DIA, same thing. It's a very, very diverse environment when you into those type of intelligence. You don't have that on the first, unless you're in cities like Detroit,
Yeah.
Houston. And if you are, we can't really count Detroit, because when you get to Detroit and get to some of those
Yeah.
cities, they're all Middle Eastern, right?
Yeah.
Like the police chief is Middle Eastern,
Yeah,
right?
I got you.
Because there's such a huge population. Houston, you might have 50, right?
Yeah.
Amongst, 15, 20,000 officers, correct?
Yeah.
Now, unless somebody's from those areas that has that interaction, how are they know this kind of
Yeah.
things?
Let me ask you, if you had more Middle Easterners in the first responders, do you think that would maybe save, even help others learn the different cultures and religions and different branches or denominations? Do you think that could help a lot more, or do you think it could maybe even cause more issues?
Well, it does help, and it does exist, but it's only in these metropolitan areas.
Well, in like maybe these smaller towns
Right.
where they only have, I don't know, nobody that's ever seen a Easterner, Muslim, any other thing than maybe Christianity or atheism. Do you think that maybe having some Middle Easterners being cops, medics, anything, first responders,
Of course.
it could help?
Of course. Yeah, it would. But here's the problem. We look at, like, say, like Jackson, Mississippi. Okay. I'll use Jackson, 125, 150,000 people.
Pretty
Metro
small.
area, yeah.
Sure.
Then the missioners that are there, they either own gas, bar lots,
Yeah,
furniture
that are in
stores,
business.
or they're doctors and they're in the
Yeah.
medical field. There ain't too many of them that want to get into law enforcement. You know why? Because nobody wants to take, Middle Easterners take a lot of pride in education, right?
Yeah.
So they'll go get a master's. They're not going to spend all that money to go get a job that pays $55,000 a year. And after taxes, you're bringing home $32,000.
I
You
can
divide
understand
that, you divide that into 12 page, 12 months. That's less than,
all the kids, wife.
right.
I mean,
In Middle Eastern community, the father, the man of the house, is the winner. The mother usually takes care of the house, raises the
Yeah.
kids. It's all traditional. And I'm talking about first generation. Now you have second generers here who are working stuff, but
Well,
you will
sure.
even see with them where you have a father, let's say a second generation, who happens to be a doctor,
Mhm.
and then the wife may be a pharmacist, right?
Mhm.
But as soon as they start having kids, she'll quit working because the focus goes
Really?
on that family unit. So it
Okay.
all falls on the father. So
I got
when
you.
you got that type of responsibility culturally to take care of your family,
Mhm.
they can't live off $32,000 a year,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Especially when they've spent $200,000 going to college and getting a
Mhm.
degree, So would it help? Of course. The problem is they're not going to attract
So
that.
important.
That's why the training is so important,
That
because
makes
the
sense.
other remedy is just to flood law enforcement with Middle
Yeah.
Easterners. You know what I'm saying?
And realistically, that's probably not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Exactly. That means literally you would have to have 60% of the United States be Middle Easterners in hopes that a percentage of them would decide to get in law enforcement.
Exactly. And which realistically, you can't depend on that.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. So that's really, really the bigger issue, because at the end of the day, law enforcement is tasked to protect the public. And I can guarantee you, if a police officer, all right, stops someone who is an ISIS member, he would not even be able to tell.
Really?
Right. And he would live with he finds out 3 days later that this guy was part of a cell that went out and committed an atrocity and killed 150 people.
I would be too.
A prime example of that is prior to 9/11, about 36 hours, and I can't really tell you exactly how many hours. I
Well,
know it was
sure.
within 2 days. Within 2 days prior to the hijackings, there was a officer up in the Northeast who was an interdiction officer looking for drugs, looking for criminals, stops one of the drivers. It stops a driver. His name was Ziad Jarrah.
Hmm.
Okay. He ended up being one of the 19 hijackers.
Really?
He stopped him. I've got the video. I show in my class. Not to, say anything bad about the officer because you
Well,
can't
sure.
really blame him. He's never been trained in that. He's looked for smugglers.
You can learn from it though.
Right. Come to find out, he was one of the people that were that was part of the hijacking. And from what the rest of his career, he go over that because you got to understand, as a cop, you're like, fuck.
Yeah.
If I was able to know what I was dealing with,
You could have stopped, and it could
I
have saved so
could
many lives.
I could have arrested him, and that could have potentially just thwarted the whole attack. And you didn't. I'm sorry, 3,000 dead people.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? So imagine having to live
I
with
couldn't.
that, right?
Heavy.
Let me tell you what happens now. You've got people, law enforcement, who are on the highway
Mhm.
looking for smugglers, okay? And I'll give you a scenario. And if, I'm sure this video is going to end up on, social media, and some supervisor somewhere, chief somewhere, some sheriff somewhere is going to imagine with the technology that's available now,
Yeah.
okay? When an officer has a car drive in front of him, okay, and those license plate readers scan it, right? It's not that he tells them who's in the car. There's a record that this car was in this place and it drove in front of this patrol car. And because that person is logged in with their name, so it'll be identified. Let's say, hypothetically, that officer runs that name, right? Runs
Okay.
that tag, and then the guy's name comes back to like, Ahmed Al-Bataini or
Okay.
something like that. Well, he's thinking to himself, shit, I don't know nothing about him. I'm going to go fuck with that dude,
Yeah.
right? Because he's afraid that he's not going to be able to culturally connect. And he
Sure.
doesn't know how to, with terrorists, or he hasn't been trained that a terrorist would drive from point A to point B,
Mm-hmm.
because they have to go places to meet up. And if they want to rendezvous, he doesn't go after it, right?
Yep.
2 days later, there's a hostage taking at a mall, and let's say 250 people get killed. That officer, unbeknownst to him, that was the guy.
Yep.
Well, guess what happens? Once the feds get involved, once the intelligence community get involved, and they narrow down what car he was in, license plate is, they're going to run it through the databases, and they're going to be like, hey, wait a minute. This dude, we'll just use a hypothetical, he was on Interstate 10 out in West Texas. Okay, let's just give it that. And not only was his tag scanned by this patrol car, according to records, inlets, National Law Enforcement Terminal, or inlets,
Yeah.
cops know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
That tag was queried by this officer within a minute of it being scanned by his car. So I wonder if this guy stopped him. Maybe we can go talk to him. Maybe if he stopped him, he's got the video. We can
Yeah.
figure out what the guy's story was, right? Because it's part of
Sure.
an investigation. So they call the cop and they go, hey, you scanned this car. Okay. You ran this tag, came back to so-and-so. Yeah. You didn't stop him? No. They're like, well, one of the guys that went to Atlanta or wherever just killed 250 people. What do you think happens to that officer? He's thinking to himself, oh my God.
Right.
Why?
There's so much guilt.
Because of the guilt, right? Because 99.9% of people get in law enforcement, they want to protect the public. So imagine somebody just told you, you failed and you failed miserably.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that people don't think about, and this is why I was saying police chiefs and sheriffs thinking about this, once that information becomes available to the media, because we always know, especially what happened with the guy in New Orleans and what happened in Las Vegas with the Tesla explosion.
Media will find out.
Their information gets out in the media. Well, now you have to work. Don't you think that their families are going to go back and sue that police department or that sheriff's department for failure to act? Because they're going to say you're partly responsible. You're tasked with the job of protecting people, but yet you didn't provide enough know-how for this dude who could have thwarted this whole thing.
Yep.
So the vicarious liability is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, it goes back to law enforcement. The way the culture is, not of the fault of their own, They're constantly just reacting to situations, right? That's why they have policies. Policies come out because somebody screws up and they're like, well, shit, we have to pay money on that one. Little policy, you can't do this anymore. So it's always reactive.
Yep.
That is the problem with law enforcement in the United States, is they're constantly just simply trying to train to how to better react to it or protect themselves from being sued. When in reality, they should be more proactive. Hey, if we have 1,000 ISIS-K members, okay, who are already in the United States because of the open borders, not only we need to have a better communication and contact with the Middle Eastern community, because they're going to be the one going to be able to pick them out before we are. We also need to train our officers on how the hell do you determine that shit when you stop a Middle Eastern dude? Because what are you going to do? Oh shit, he's got a big beard and he's got a kufi on and he's got this and he's got that, and my God, he must be ISIS?
Must be a terrorist.
Exactly. So that is where law enforcement is today. And my hope is that people who are in power, which means they will start thinking ahead and start training to prevent these kind of things from happening. Because unlike a drug smuggler, unlike someone who's involved in theft or, organized crime, these people, their crime happens once they have already deployed it, but the ideology still exists in them. Reality is, you can't put anybody in for having fucked up ideology.
Well, sure.
Right? But here's the thing. If an officer is able to determine, okay, and there's two ways he can determine. A member of the comes to him and says, hey, dude, something's going on here. We need somebody to watch him. That officer now passes that information to the authorities. When I say authorities, meaning people who are capable of start watching this guy because they have a legitimate concern from a community member. Let's say a community member doesn't come to him. Let's say a guy stops a guy on an interstate or, on a boulevard, let's say on Westheimer Road in Houston, Texas, right? A Houston PD officer stops him and the guy is acting kinky, right? And the officer has enough know-how to kind of test this guy's ideology, and he starts picking up on some things that are not necessarily kosher, so to say, okay? They're not legit. You could tell the guy's kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. At that, can he have freedom of religion? But could he turn on the FBI, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and say, hey, man, I don't know if this guy's got anything going on. I asked him several things. He gave me some information. The way he was talking, I started picking up some things that are related to ISIS and some of these cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs people. At least the Joint Terrorism Task Force now goes, wait a minute, this guy lives here? We didn't even know he's... So they'll start looking into it because you know what? They're the ones who are going to be able to take these leads and either confirm or deny that suspicion because they have the capability to look into it further. So that's my hope, is to at least do my part to try to educate not only the public, right? The Middle Eastern community to go, hey man, if you see shit like this, go to the cops, please.
Speak up.
Speak up, FBI. Okay, nobody's gonna rat you out, all right? Put the culture aside, go to them because these people, all of us look bad, okay? And it's not right, all right? You shouldn't ignore it. Also help the parents because these terrorist groups, they will recruit American kids. Their dirty work for them. They don't give a shit, right? They're just trying to make some sort of political statement or they're trying to cause mass casualties because some of these people have hatred for the West and the Western society. And some of them, they had other religions because according to their brand, they are the true religion. For example, they're the only Muslims. That's why they kill so many other Muslims. Because if they don't brand of Islamic law and Islamic interpretation, then they're not Muslims. They're non-believers. Okay, so that's where we stand, and hopefully, if nobody even looks into it further, maybe just watching this interview, people going, man,
or even on your class,
and let's say they can't come to the class, at least start researching, right? Watch some more videos. You also have to be careful watching videos because just like I could make videos and put it on YouTube, so could those people put it up on YouTube to manipulate.
They could also sugarcoat it and make it sound super believable and super realistic too.
Exactly. And that's another thing too. There is a tendency in the Middle Eastern community to kind of downplay things, right? When in reality, my son who watches this is calling it out. Because when you people, why are all these terrorist attacks happening and the Muslims are not condemning it? I can tell you right now, 99% of Muslims they don't like it.
Yeah.
But the problem is culturally they're afraid to speak out because they don't want to be shunned away. A
Yeah.
tribal culture, tribal that's expected. And that's a whole
I was about to say,
different
that's a whole other topic. I know they're
It
very
is.
loyal.
It is, right. And I cover all that in the because
Yeah.
all of these dynamics play a
It all
role
plays
in
a
it.
part. I mean, you got to know it.
Exactly. So hopefully, at least by watching this video, the cops will start going, "Hey man, I need to know more about this." The
Sure.
goes, "Holy shit, I need to know more about this."
Mhm.
Okay, and the Middle Eastern community can say, hey, "Holy shit, if we're going to try to live here and be happy, part of the community, we need to do our part and not withhold information because." When they do atrocities, we're the having to pay for it. Just like that 7-year-old poor Palestinian kid right after October 7th, 7 years old, gets stabbed by some old, crazy guy,
Yep.
right? Because what happens overseas is now taken out on him. What
Yep.
the hell did he have to do with it? Personally, I've had to
innocent.
deal, yeah. And me personally, I've had to deal with it a lot. When I say a lot, over almost I had to deal with it 3 times in law enforcement
Yeah.
by other cops. But I'm not angry because they're just ignorant. Ignorant doesn't,
sure.
it's like they're stupid. It's just they don't know any better,
Well, sure.
right? The last that happened to me is I had to go through a lot of legal issues because one guy, his mentality was this goat herder doesn't need to be a cop or teach cops
Yep.
in this country. So I look at it and go, what a piece of shit.
Yep.
But at the same time, go, why is he a piece of shit?
Yeah, he has no other knowledge of anything.
He has no
doesn't
other
know
knowledge.
Not another culture, doesn't know the religion, doesn't know how loyal they truly are. So therefore, he just assumes everybody's the same.
Exactly. So guess what? Now I got targeted for it. But you know
Exactly.
what? That could be prevented. Everybody
Exactly.
working together, everybody getting educated because
Yep.
we all have a common enemy. The Middle Easterners, the parents, the cops, we all have a common enemy. We
Yep.
got people who are sick in the head. They're just trying to kill a lot of people.